Hello and welcome back to Sex Therapy Thoughts with Eleanor, or Elle, whatever you want to call me is fine. I hope you have a nice beverage. I have a huge Yeti full of ice water. The fan is on. It is November 19th and it is 80 degrees. So I just got back from walking my dog. I'm a little sweaty. I wanted to pop on today because I've been chewing on this consultation session I had with one of my supervisors last week for a week. And it really was a very juicy conversation. And so I wanted to share it here. And it's not fully formed in my brain yet, but I love sharing my process with you. And I find so much of sharing my process of how I'm figuring out things like calls other people in to share their thoughts or their reflections, or brings up something in them, which then helps both of us figure it out, which is really cool. And that's a much more collaborative, community-oriented way of sharing, which I prefer, rather than me being like, I'm the expert and I know everything, here you go. So I wanted to share this consultation I did with Rachel Lewis-Marlow. She is the founder of the Embodied Recovery Institute. I do my training with her. I am currently in the process of booking my tier 2 training next year, which I'm very excited about. But something I brought to her last week was noticing that several folks I was working with around anorgasmia, which is difficulty having an orgasm or inability to have an orgasm over an extended period of time. I was noticing a lot of somatic constriction, a real sense of having to make oneself small. And oh God, my brain's already spinning. There's so many things to talk about with this. And I really do believe that a lot of this is, okay, let me zoom out. A lot of my clients come with this constriction, the somatic constriction of making oneself small. It's usually in response to a lot of things, but for my clients, it tends to be one of two things. Sexual trauma tends to be a big one. And then the second one is attachment trauma. So growing up in a long-term situation where there's abuse, neglect, narcissistic parent, a parent with a drinking problem, a parent with an eating disorder, a high-functioning perfectionist, workaholic parent, where the people, the client, whoever, myself, whoever, felt like they had to make themselves really small in order to stay safe. So there becomes a sort of somatic constriction of the nervous system in the body into the center, right? I'm gonna make myself as small as possible, literally and figuratively, emotionally. I might have a hard time expressing my emotions. I might not know what they are. It kind of comes out as people pleasing a lot of the time, right? Like I'm gonna leave myself behind and only make space for you. And so I was talking to her about that and really noticing how this went. She brought up a really good point, which is she said she thinks of sexual energy in sort of the way acupuncturists talk about energy. Now, I am not an acupuncturist. I have been a client of acupuncture twice and I loved it. And I remember the way my acupuncturist explained it to me is the way acupuncture looks at things is sort of there's like energy flowing and there's channels and then there's dams. And so sometimes the work of acupuncture is to like open the dam in one spot to get the energy flowing again. And then maybe there's too much energy flowing here, it's like redirect it. And so that's kind of the process of acupuncture at a very, very bird's eye view. Again, I've only been a client, I'm not a practitioner, but Rachel invited me to look at anorgasmia through the lens of sexual energy flowing through the body. And I'm looking at my notes I took here because this is really something I've been chewing on for the last week since she and I spoke. And so I took a lot of notes, but also had to stop taking notes at one point because I was just listening. When you're like writing, and you're like, I actually just have to listen because this is such good information. So we talked about how that constriction, the energy can move, but then it can also get constricted. We talked about how a lot of times that can happen in the pelvic area. And I was just thinking as a therapist and as a movement instructor, probably the two biggest areas of constriction I've noticed in people's bodies tend to be like neck, shoulders, like traps, this kind of area, or the pelvis. Not to say it doesn't happen anywhere else, it commonly happens, but the more like chronic constriction of the body tends to be here and here, which I find interesting because they almost kind of parallel each other, right? It's like the top of the core and the bottom of the core, because your core is this kind of big can here. So that's always really interesting. So she was sort of talking about, and you can think about that literally, how we think about how often I refer to pelvic floor PTs to help my clients with either having overactive, a tight pelvic floor, or an underactive, looser pelvic floor. And she also said you can even think about it how sometimes people talk about the chakras, like, right, the root chakra, sacral chakra, probably more sacral chakra, I guess, in this point. But thinking of that, that's kind of a common vocabulary people use to talk about energy in that area. And of course, that sexual energy isn't just sexual. This is the entire thesis of my work. It's creative. It's it creates intimacy in all kinds of ways: friendships, collaborations, neighbors, community efforts, organizing efforts. It's artistic. It does generate new life, as well as, like, you know, obviously the more sexual or sensual context of that energy as well. So she actually had us go through a really important exercise I thought was really interesting, where she had me take my hand, and she did this with herself as well too, and kind of find a place that feels constricted on the hand. And imagine, I'm gonna go with my left hand because I'm right-handed. So I kind of find a place that, okay, I can kind of feel that constriction, that kind of tight knot feeling. And she had me press, using my thumb, into that constricted area and notice what happens. And I notice I feel more constricted, it feels more locked up, and the more I'm focusing on the hand that is pressing, actually the more stagnant it feels, if I'm being honest. It feels like there's less energy flow through the hand. Okay. So now she had me do it a second time, and this time what I'm gonna do is I'm going to actually bring my internal focus into the inside of my hand. So rather than the right hand that's doing the pushing, I'm actually gonna bring my internal focus, this is neurological, this is my brain, I'm going to map what's happening on the inside of my hand where the constriction is, and just sort of breathe, or, well, not even, I'm just gonna notice. Okay, I was not controlling my reaction. What I immediately noticed is I felt my shoulders drop. I felt an instant exhale. That's why I said I wasn't gonna control my breathing. I was gonna wait and see what happened, because I work out, I'm used to breathing through kind of constriction feelings, but I wanted this to be a little different. I wanted the sensation, I wanted the movement to follow the sensation, not the other way around. And I noticed a lot more energy flowing between, in that space of constriction. Yeah, to the point where, okay, now I can kind of feel the constrictions move to other places that were sort of around that spot, but that spot doesn't feel so constricted to me anymore, which is really cool, right? And I was not controlling that reaction, that exhale, not like, right? The kind of release that tells me that the nervous system, we tend to notice first, especially if you're watching from the outside, through the breath, right? So that can tell me that there's been a release, that I can feel my body come back into balance. And then I don't feel like I have to have that kind of constricted, like up here, that we can sometimes get. So after we did that exercise, we sort of talked about what that feels like to have a space that feels constricted. And, you know, when we're talking about sex, it's interesting because there's actually that, see, my brain runs in so many directions. Okay. That would be a really interesting exercise to do by yourself. If you're with a partner or partners, it's interesting because we can't control the other person. We can communicate. Communication, one of my favorite things to talk about as a sex therapist. We should be communicating. We can't control that. But what does that feel like to have someone come into a place that feels constricted and to focus so much on the tension of it being pushed? How would that feel different to shift your orientation into mapping the spot? So I'm not focused on the pushing. There needs to be, and again, I would try this by yourself first, but I'm instead focusing on the internal experience of my hand receiving the push, or whatever it is, right? So I thought that was really interesting, and it brought up this conversation about how do people show up to our sexual energy. We talked about the pelvis as sort of a container for sexual energy. And again, creative energy, regenerative energy, what's the word I'm looking for? Like innovative energy. And if it's yours, and it should be, and that's a lot of work I do too, around reclaiming your sovereignty, around yourself and your body, your energy. And what does that feel like? How does that feel to orient into you coming into space with it, rather than responding to someone pushing on the constriction? I don't know, it's just really interesting, right? I haven't fully as I said, you're watching me process this out as I figure it out. But I think that's a really interesting tool, and I like it because it gives us something that we control, right? There's so many things out of our control, and it's really nice to think about, okay, how can I orient into this process in a way that feels spacious for me and makes me feel like I'm the one with sovereignty over my body and over my energy. So I thought that was really interesting. And a question I wrote down as she was talking is, what are we attuning to? So I don't know what that meant in the moment, but I do think that comes into, what are we attuning to? Are we attuning to some sort of external pressure, whether that's a pressure to succeed or perform or have an orgasm or be good enough, whatever, be good girl, I don't know. Or are we attuning to a more internal state, what we're feeling internally, and maybe the connection between ourselves and the other person, or the connection with ourselves. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Okay, so I just wanted to share that because I found that really exciting and fascinating to think about. Even thinking about it from like a movement perspective, like there is pressure to perform, right? A lot of us put it on ourselves. Sometimes the algorithm puts it on us, but are we attuning to that constriction and that pressure of the external world, or are we moving inward and mapping our own experience and finding spaciousness that way? So whether that means you flow better, or whether it means you have better orgasms or more of them, or whether that means you just feel more balanced and less out of whack, less chaotic, I don't know. Okay, those are my thoughts. Exploring somatic sex therapy today, and I appreciate you for hanging in there with me. Have a great day.